Hello everyone and welcome to the Speeki webinar series. My name is Scott Lane and I'm going to be the leader of today's webinar. For those of you who have not joined a Speeki webinar before, we welcome you to the series. The Speeki webinars are designed to be a relatively quick review of a specific topic where we cover in 30 minutes or less. As a result, we may not get time to have some Q&A sessions as part of the webinar. However, if you do have questions, feel free to reach out to my team or to reach out on the chat function, and we'll get back to you at the end of the session or as soon as we can. For those of you that have been to a Speeki webinar before, and there's been tens of thousands of you, thank you very much for getting involved. Today's topic is about due diligence, and as the title suggests, you can conduct supplier-based due diligence in 4 simple steps. Now, many of you may look at that title and be intrigued as to how to do 4 simple steps. We're going to try and explain that through the course of this webinar. Firstly, before we get started, a little bit about myself and my background. Myself and some members of my team at Speeki have been involved in supplier due diligence for the best part of 20 years. We've been involved in building some of the world's largest programs for supplier due diligence and also on the sales channel as well, helping Fortune 500 companies and helping companies across a broad spectrum of industries by looking at their supply chain, looking at their programs that they built and trying to make them intelligent and efficient and something that actually adds value rather than programs and simply conduct due diligence for due diligence sake and don't really manage risk at all. So part of that has involved conducting due diligence in over 100 countries and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of due diligence cases and reviews, programs from all walks of life. With that knowledge and with that expertise, the Speeki team has come up with some solutions in this space. But specifically, we look at things fairly simply. And not to overcomplicate or to confuse everyone, we have broken it down into 4 simple steps. And that's what we're going to cover in today's session. Firstly, before we get started, I just want to focus on a little bit of background. Firstly, today's focus is on suppliers. It is on those members of the supply chain for which you may conduct due diligence. We're not focused today on the sales channel, distributors, resellers, agents, brokers, dealers, but we're focused on the supply chain. Secondly, we are doing this through a lens of ESG and sustainability. Now, many of you have looked at due diligence through a different lens in a former life. That may have been associated with sanctions or perhaps bribery and corruption. But the lens that we're looking through in this webinar is relative to ESG and sustainability. The second issue that I want to cover in the introduction is a little bit of definitions. Firstly, if we break down the word due diligence, it means a lot of things to a lot of people. In fact, if you type due diligence into Google or you ask someone what due diligence means, you get lots and lots of different responses. Everything from acquisition type due diligence through to background checks to screening data, but you get lots of answers. So today we're going to break it down into some very simple activities. We look at due diligence by saying it's about conducting research. That's all due diligence is doing. It is conducting research. We are gathering research in order to gather facts. And then once we have some facts, we make a decision. And that decision is whether or not, for example, that supplier is someone that we want to engage with. That supplier has someone that has a similar approach to us when it comes to a particular issue, in this case, ESG and sustainability. It could be whether or not that supplier meets our level of risk, our risk appetite. Is that supplier the right fit for us. So as we go through this process, remember, don't get caught up on the definition of due diligence. Break it into a simple process of we are conducting research in order to gather facts. And those facts should tell us whether or not this is a supplier that is someone that we want to work with or we don't want to work with. And of course, we're doing that through a particular lens, the lens that we've already discussed in ESG. Now, firstly, let's start at the basics. Step one should be obvious to everybody, but to be honest, every day I get involved in reviewing programs and it's not that obvious when it comes to procurement teams or perhaps people in the workplace when they're thinking about suppliers. The step number one is that not all suppliers are the same. Now, again, that might seem obvious, but we need to start at the top and work down. Now, when we look at your supplier base, it will tell a story about the sort of suppliers that you work with. And you'll be able to tell from those sets of suppliers where you work with them, how you work with them, the countries, their level of importance, how much money they spend, how important they are to the business, whether they're deemed as strategic, and all of that information is very valuable information. It tells you a lot because, again, it's part of the facts that you're going to obtain and assess. Now, of course, those facts are things that you probably already have through your procurement process, which is fantastic. You don't have to conduct due diligence because you've already got those facts. Most of you collect those facts through doing some form of questionnaire or having someone complete information in a portal, or you know what your supplier is doing with you. So that's fantastic. They're fantastic facts because what they can do is they will help you with the other research you do. Will be starting to build a risk picture of this particular supplier. Now, of course, when you look at it from a sustainability lens and you add in some local knowledge and you add in some additional issues that may be important to you as a company or something that is you're focused on or something that you've had issues before and you don't want to repeat, or you know that is a hot button for the industry, you can start to build this mental picture as to what are some of the areas that you might want to focus on versus others. Step one of our very simple 4-step process is focused on thinking. It's more than a supplier risk assessment, but it's thinking about the way in which you engage suppliers and thinking about how would you gather information in order to form a view against a large supply chain. And that view is looked at through this sustainability lens. Now, as you move from the top and you start coming down, you'll start to say, well, what about knowing the relevant risk in a particular supplier? So now I have this vision of what types of suppliers might be a concern, but how do I know what this supplier can do based on this supplier's information? Well, that's the next layer down. We're now saying, well, we know that there's some general kind of gross risks. We've worked out that someone in this industry, in this country doing these things with this size and complexity has these general kind of risks. But now what about this supplier? Do they match that risk or have they done something to reduce that risk? So as you go through this process, you're starting out with this high level map of gross risks. And then you're saying to yourself, as I apply that set of gross risks to a particular supplier, how is that going to be relevant to me? So all things being equal, what is this supplier going to do that could hurt me? Is that assessment of that gross risk correct or not for this particular supplier? Again, based on the information that you know about them or that you have collected. Some of this information you may already know. Others you can determine relatively quickly. A little bit of know-how, a little bit of activity, a little bit of knowledge about the industry, a little bit of knowledge about risk, how things happen, when they happen, what your issues are, what the supplier is doing. It's not rocket science, but it is starting to say, all things being equal, what is the risk in this particular supplier? Step 3 should be fairly obvious. It's now saying, well, now that we understand the gross risk in this supplier, is it true or not? In fact, is what we think is happening, is that happening or not? We think there's risk in this particular supplier based on the process we've been through. Is it true or not? What has the supplier done to reduce that risk? And the answer is, I generally don't know. We need to find out. So we conduct research. Some of that research might be by asking them some questions. It might be gathering some information. It might be saying to them, we think you're, for example, higher risk. You tell me if that's correct or not. You tell me how you're managing risk. You tell me whether or not it's lower risk by giving me information. Give me data so I can assess that. I can make that decision whether the net risk is something I'm happy with or not. So you tell me. You tell me some information, you answer some questions, but perhaps do an interview, perhaps participate in a background check. Maybe I need to do some research offline, public sources. Maybe I need to ask you to show me some of the things that you've done. Ask you to show me whether you have a rating or a score or a certification, or you have something that you can make me validate whether my view of the risk is in fact what your view of the risk is. The ultimate answer is that you get to a net risk position. And you're saying, we started out with a gross risk. I don't know whether you meet that gross risk because it's a general assessment. It's not a specific assessment. It's an objective assessment across categories, but I don't know if you're particularly good at managing risk, or you're very special, or you've done some special things, or you've taken on additional levels of risk management, and therefore your risk is low. I have no idea. So the answer is I need to conduct research to find out. As I gather those facts, what I'm doing is saying, has my position changed? What is the net risk that I end up with? Is that net risk something that I'm comfortable with or not? And then step 4 is, now that I've got this net risk, and I say, well, actually, this company's got some good things, it's got some bad things, but there are still gaps that I'm not comfortable with. There is essentially net risk. What do I do with it? Do I go forward? Do I not go forward? Do I find someone else that's got a better risk profile? Or do I try and rehabilitate? Or do I ask them to do things? And so I manage that net risk by asking them to do things. I can contractually shift that risk, contractually shift it to them. I could insure that risk by contractually shifting it somewhere else. I could manage that risk by asking them to take on additional elements that would reduce the risk. So you could reduce your risk further if you obtain some sort of certification. It would make me a lot more comfortable if you have that. It would make me a lot more comfortable if you had a score from a good organization that does scoring or ratings. It would make me feel more comfortable if I conduct an audit. Again, these things are meant to rehabilitate. We've got the facts. The facts are that there is net risk. The question is, what do we do about it? Do we keep going or not? And if we keep going, what are the conditions that we take, if any, to reduce the risk further? What you've probably worked out from this process, hopefully, is that this is about assessing risk in a supplier. What can this supplier do to hurt us? Now, we know, again, that gross risk, because that's obvious. We can look at industries and we can look at locations. We can get this gross risk idea. But then what are the things that we need to do in order to work out what this supplier does versus other suppliers in order to reduce that risk? Because I have a view, and the question is that view correct or not? We move from the objective to the subjective. Now, many of you are probably looking at this and thinking, well, what do we see in our reviews when we're in companies? Well, I must say, I don't see a lot of this risk thinking. What I see a lot is actually a lot of non-risk-based thinking, or I see a lot of shortcuts on the research. Research is done, but it's not really done with a purpose. It's just kind of done. The results of that are sometimes not thought of in this risk management way. They're kind of thought as a remediation, but actually everyone does the same thing. Everyone has to sign a code of conduct. Everyone has to sign a contract. Everyone has to, sign a form saying they're the best company in the world when it comes to sustainability. These sorts of things are not necessarily actionable remediation options. They don't necessarily reduce the risk. So what are some of the key things that I would take away? Firstly, step one is very important. It's the foundation for the other steps. It requires a lot of knowledge. It requires a lot of experience, a lot of assessments, a lot of data, a lot of review of history to really get this assessment done. And what you're looking at is the root gross risk. You're trying to assess gross risk, and you're trying to do it across all of the sustainability and ESG areas. It's tough. Remember, step two is starting to then tailor it for the actual supplier. And we say, well, what does this supplier do? And there's not a lot of analysis given right now for most companies. Most companies send out the same sort of due diligence. They do the same sort of screening. They do the same sort of questionnaire. They do the same kind of process than they do for everyone. And sometimes that process isn't really tailored. It's not thought through. And it doesn't necessarily have that level of analysis that is thinking about reducing risk. The step three piece that we often see in the market where people are struggling is, well, now that we've done some sort of assessment, how do we do the research? And there's an over-reliance on questionnaires because it's easy and it's cheap. It's virtually free. So sending questionnaires is an over-reliance and it's done. Sending background checks or doing audits or doing assessments or reviews or interviews or some of the other things that you might want to do are sometimes seen as a bit expensive. And of course they would be if you're doing it across 1,000 suppliers, but no one's suggesting that. No one's suggesting that at all. It might be over 5, might be over 10, but it depends on the risk about what you've assessed and what you would need to do in order to get the facts, in order to make a decision. Now, there's a lot of opportunities to get smart here, a lot of ratings opportunities, a lot of scoring, a lot of communal systems that can help to rate companies. Some are better than others, but there might be some shortcuts that you can do in order to get this assessment a little bit better. But most companies are not doing background checks on suppliers. They're not doing deep background checks or reviews or assessments. They're typically, for most suppliers, they're doing a one-size-fits-all questionnaire, which collects some data, but isn't always tailored to the right specific issues that you know as the risk. And finally, step 4 works really well, to be honest. Step 4 is a very simple process that says, based on the net risk that we have, is this someone that's acceptable or not? And that really requires a lot of analysis because it requires someone with expertise to be able to look at this and say, well, what is the net risk? What did I learn from step 3 that I now say, step 4, we need to manage this risk further? And the challenge in step 4 is to do things that matter, that do things that reduce the risk further. So, for example, signing a code of conduct or perhaps signing a standard contract that includes a clause that says comply with all laws or comply with our code, is that shifting the needle to say to that supplier, we reduce our risk? You might reduce your legal risk, maybe, contractual risk, perhaps, assuming it's done correctly. But is it going to improve the third party or the supplier? Not particularly. Is it going to drive them to a different level? Not particularly. Is it going to help them understand your expectations and move towards better compliance? Unlikely. Is it going to give them a path forward, a direction? Is it going to clarify your expectations? Is it going to be something that is verifiable or something you can validate? Highly unlikely. So step 4 is a really important step. It is the weakest of most organizations that fall back to some simple tasks like contracts and clauses and codes of conduct that really don't shift the needle. Now, the reason that all of this is becoming quite important is because of the new changes around the world. So, as part of that, it is placing an obligation on each of you, in particularly Europe and other parts of the world, to not just conduct due diligence, but conduct due diligence that has an action that reduces risk, that reduces the likelihood of an event, that reduces the likelihood of a human rights issue or an environmental issue. It has an aim to end human rights and environmental issues, not to conduct due diligence. That's not the aim of the law. The aim of the law is to end these things. And the aim of the law is to assist the supplier to the extent that they need it to expand their compliance initiatives and to become more sustainable or more focused on HR environmental. So, like all Speeki webinars, we focus on the top 5 areas that we would focus on. After all of the things that we've said, these are the top 5 things that we would seriously consider. Firstly, take some time to think through these 4 steps. Now, they may be right for you, or they may be something that you're partially already doing. What I don't see being done particularly well is this assessment of risk, meaning there's an assessment of process, and the supplier goes through a qualification process. The supplier goes through an onboarding process. The supplier goes through a questionnaire process. But it's not really that. What we're talking about is that the supplier is going through a risk assessment process to determine whether this supplier meets the expectations that we have for a supplier, for our company, in these circumstances, providing these goods and services in this country at this point in time for this cost base. That's what we're trying to do. So we're making this assessment as to whether or not this supplier meets our standards, our expectations, whether it is appropriate, whether we want to take on the risk of this supplier. This is a risk assessment process. It's not really a qualification process. It's not really a questionnaire process. It's a risk analysis process. And in order to do risk analysis, we need really good understandings of risk, the gross risks, and we need understandings of when people do things to manage risk, they end up with a net risk. And we need to know what this party does in order to manage and get to that net risk. Then we need to understand the net risk. And then we need to say to ourselves, is that something we can live with or not? So as you go through those 4 steps, think about applying it to your own company and thinking through how much of what the team does is risk assessments, qualification, and management of our supplier risks versus the process, which may be driving some of these behaviors versus a risk assessment behavior. Now, we know that ESG and sustainability risks are a focus of regulators. And we know, both in Europe and in other countries, that this is going to significantly increase. And it will require companies to have a better handle on their suppliers. It will require them to know a lot more about their suppliers. It will require them to assess risk in their suppliers. And again, if you're not convinced, have a read of either the German Supply Chain Act or the CSDDD directive, and you will see the focus on risks assessments and understanding risk, managing risk, having a process around risk, looking at the risk in each. It talks about risk. It continually talks about risk. And again, risk is something that is a known quantity. We know how to do risk. There's a standard out there that tells you how to do it, ISO 31000, that tells you how to manage risk. It's a very standard process within organizations. Manage risk is key. So we are going to be required to do a lot more on suppliers and a lot more on managing risk in those suppliers. So if you are listening and you think that the program might need to be improved or assessed or perhaps even rebooted, then think through this risk concept and how it really does apply. And ask yourself the question, are we doing a risk assessment of our supply and our supply chain, or are we doing an onboarding and qualification process? I think the two things are different. There's some process relationship, but I think they're a little different. Third thing that I would focus on is that as you do this risk-based approach, applying the same methodology to every supplier just doesn't make sense. That's not a risk-based approach. I have seen hundreds of programs of very sophisticated, mature companies that send the same structure, do the same process to virtually every supplier on the basis that doing the same thing is better than doing nothing. Therefore, we're taking a higher bar. That's not really what a risk-based approach is. What a risk-based approach is determining what a gross level of risk is for a particular supplier to do particular things at a particular point in time in a particular country with a particular set of skills and a particular price point. And then saying, well, is this supplier meet that or not? Applying that risk methodology is the only way that this can work at scale. There is no suggestion that anyone, including myself, is saying that you need to increase or to make more complex the type of research or due diligence. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, some of the programs I look at, I think it's extremely overdone in most areas and extremely underdone in others. Areas that are quite high risk are not really considered at all because they get the same process. So I'm not suggesting people need to do more. In many cases, I'm suggesting you need to do less, but you focus your attention on the highest risk. But to do that means you need to have a slick process that understands risk, how to identify it, how to assess it, how to manage it, and how to remediate it. The fourth thing that I'd consider of is that it's a skill. And it's a skill because the topics that are covered across ESG and sustainability are very, very broad. We've talked about some of the skills around human rights and environmental, but just look at what that means. If you go and have a look at the definitions of human rights and environmental as it applies to the European law, the definitions go onto 2 pages. It's not a definition of human rights thinking child slavery or environmental thinking polluting a river. The definitions of both of those go literally to 2 pages. They are quite detailed definitions, which includes gender pay gaps. It includes gender ratings and numbers. It also includes whether or not, for example, employees can form labor unions or have rights of association. It includes Indigenous impacts. It includes impact on communities. It includes impact on water, natural resources, and of course, emissions, which are more relevant now than years gone by when we're required to do scope 3 emissions. So if you look at those issues and you start to build in others, bribery, corruption, transparency, governance, whistleblowing, privacy, security, access, information security, you will start to see that the number of issues are quite broad. So being able to be targeted and being able to be focused and having a governance system around that and relying on the work that you're doing and not feeling as though you're going to miss things. And so we just do everything to everyone in fear of missing something. That's probably not a license for success in this situation. It has to be risk-based. So understanding risk in supply chain is a huge expectation and undertaking. Finally, the onboarding of suppliers is going to require some work. It's going to require some technology, some process, some budget, some resource, some skill set, some understanding, some audit, some review, some monitoring, some measuring, some verification, some validation, and perhaps some audit. All of those things are basic expectations. the signing up a supplier and hoping that they don't have any problems and putting them on some watch list for sanctions and checking them, hoping that that's relevant, is probably not something that is going to be effective going forward. The verification, validation, or audit of the system that you have will be key, but the verification, validation, and audit of the due diligence that you have done on a supplier will be relevant, particularly if you've asked that supplier to take on additional steps. Step number 4. So the verification of the way in which the supplier manages risk will need to be completed. So there is going to be an ongoing task management impact to this cycle. Hopefully, what you have seen is a very quick but deep review of the 4 steps. If there was anything that I'd leave you with, it would be that think about how the teams are doing the risk assessments, how they're doing the risk reviews, think about the mechanics and the operations of what they're asking for, how they're assessing it, how they're dealing with remediation, red flags, follow-up, verification, validation, and audit. That's what a supplier risk management program is. Obviously, there's a lot of issues to cover within 30 minutes, so if anyone does have any questions, I'm happy to answer them outside or to schedule a follow-up with the sales team. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Speeki webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you at subsequent versions. Thanks very much for joining. Take care.